in the 70s, the idea of bringing people on a particular contract, taking their liberty, and sort of thinking about that mode of sort of radical exploitation, but also how this is really tied to the sort of structural political economy of Lebanon, i.e. how it enables certain children to emigrate because they can leave their old parents with basically domestic workers with no rights, that then they can basically send money to basically these parents. So there's a whole sort of political economy cycle that has in it imbricated questions of gender, questions of race, questions of basically pseudo-indentured labor, and questions of immigration.
Welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have Fadi Bardawil, who is a professor at Duke University and the author of the book Revolution and Disenchantment, Arab Marxism and the Binds of Emancipation. He does many things as well, including writing for Megaphone, the incredibly popular and influential publication in Lebanon, as well as the Arabic edition of Journal for Palestine Studies. Fadi, welcome to Afikra.
Thank you, Mikey. Thanks so much.
So I live in Hamra, and like growing up here, it's very, very popular for kids to say, oh, you know, I'm totally into Marx, I'm a leftist. I'm curious, when you lived in Lebanon, do you feel like generally people have a grasp on what it means to be a Marxist, or is that like the most fundamentally misunderstood term, both in Lebanon, but globally?
Well, I think that's a difficult question to ask and to answer basically from a social scientist. I can tell you what my experience
tell me.
Is and how I was drawn to questions that have to do with the left. Growing up, you know, some of my friends came from families who were parts of leftist or Marxist parties in Lebanon, like the Communist Party or the Organization of Communist Action in Lebanon. That wasn't my case. For me, the question of the left, growing up in the late 70s, when I was born, early 80s in Beirut, was a way in which one can open up a common political field outside of sectarian barriers, for one, but also one in which one can think of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the sort of Palestinian resistance to Israel outside of basically narrow sectarian articulations of it, whether you are for it or against it. So my attraction to leftist idioms as I was growing up as a teenager came around through this basically these sets of questions. And you know, it's not always through books that one gets acquainted with certain ideas. Popular culture, in my case, was very important. The plays of Ziad Rahbani and his music, for example, and other sorts of productions that were then sort of grouped under, the al-Ughniya al-Multazima, the politically committed art or politically committed songs, were important in this sort of coming of age story. So were also in the 90s a very, very important outlet for us was Mulha al-Nahar, the supplement of Nahar that was edited by Ilyas Khouri, and that had amongst its writers basically a lot of the 1960s generations of leftists who were then in the early 90s writing then. So it's very much an overdetermined atmosphere. Once you're interested in these questions, you kind of start listening to certain things, reading others, and also going to attend some performances. Masrah Beirut as well was a very important venue then for exploring questions like that. So
it's for sure. I would imagine most people, pop culture is their entry point. I want to talk a little bit about the way your book is structured. And I think it introduced me to an interesting storyline that starts in the 1920s, essentially, and walks through the 20th century. And you would introduce these some dates that I I thought, oh yeah, of course we're going to talk about 1967, for example. But there's some other dates that are a little more surprising to me, like 1961, 1958. If you could, just humor me. Can you sort of
Right.
give a broad overview of that timeline and how that relates to the left in Lebanon specifically?
Sure. I mean, part of so this book really tried to zoom in closely on a generation of militant intellectuals who then became prominent public intellectuals, people like Fawaz Trabulsi, Ahmed Baidoun, Wadah Sharara, Abbas Baidoun, Azza Sharara Baidoun, etc., who were, if you want to really summarize it, you can say that this is a generation that basically moved from sort of being Arab nationalists to becoming left critics of Arab nationalists and Marxists, to most of them, not all of them, then becoming sort of disenchanted with the question of revolution, with the outbreak of the Lebanese civil war, and their really experience of the recalcitrance of a Lebanese sectarian communal attachments. So in a way, there's that timeline, and I'll go back to the dates in a minute. That timeline is really a timeline of thinking through Arab nationalism, if you want, Marxism, and then communal sectarian strife. Now, this is a generation that was born roughly between the mid-30s and the mid-40s. A lot of them were born in the sort of early 40s, like 41, 42.
Yeah.
And so when you're born, when you're born around 1940, and when you're 8 years old, you wake up one day and you realize that there are Palestinian refugees in your neighborhood. So the Nakba, the Palestinian Nakba of 1948, is not an abstract phenomenon that one works with as a historical marker. For this generation, it was very much a lived experience. So I have interviews with some of these militants, like Mahmoud Swed, who was born, I think, in the late 30s, who was a bit older, who sort of remembers as a kid basically gathering donations to bring to the incoming refugees who just got into Saida, Sur, Beirut. So you have your life world as a child is basically very much fashioned by this foundational event of current Arab history. Comes, a few years later comes basically the free officers coup and the coming to power of Nasser and the free officers in 1952 in Egypt. So you're 12 years old, etc. And then the Suez Canal in 56. Coming to 58 is very important because what you have then is basically the union between Egypt and Syria to found the United Arab Republic.
Yeah.
This is a very, very important event because it's an event where, that sort of in a way materializes the idea that the Arab nation, once colonialism is going to be kicked out, is going to unite. Because it is a nation that was divided by foreign colonial imperial interests, divide and rule, conquer and rule.
Yeah.
61.
Before you get to 61, I want to ask you a question about before you get to 61. When you talk about Arab nationalism, are you exclusively talking about the Nasser-style Arab nationalism of the 20th century, or is it related at all to the Nahda and sort of Boutros Substani and that type of stuff? Like we are Arabs.
No, that's a great question. I think Nasser is a bit of a latecomer in that game because there were basically Arab nationalist formations, who were there, like the Ba'ath Party, that was quite influential, and someone like Fawaz Trabulsi was in his youth a member of the Ba'ath Party. Someone like Wadah gravitated as well in Ba'athist circles. So most of these militants who would become Marxists, so to speak, had, in a way, one way or another, a relationship with non-Nasserite basically Arab nationalist movements. The other one was the Arab nationalist movement, حركة القوميين العرب.
Yeah.
out of which grew on the Palestinian faction, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and from the Lebanese end of things, منظمة الاشتراكيين اللبنانيين, the sort of organization of Lebanese socialists grew out of it. So really, there was formations. I mean, of course, one can sort of trace genealogies to sort of to earlier iterations, but I think the question of Palestine for these Arab nationalists was key, and the question of rebirth, as in Ba'ath, really the sort of Arabic meaning of the term, was quite important. And then there are other, one can go into sort of influences, whether on the Arab side or the French side, influences of thinkers like Bergson, more or less. But yeah, definitely Nasser was definitely not the main player.
Yeah.
When it comes to Arab nationalism, for sure.
Okay, sorry to interrupt the story. So let's go back to 1961.
No, so 61, what happens is that there's a rupture, Syria, of the United Arab Republic between Syria and Egypt. And that's a very, very big blow for this generation of mostly then college students. If you're born in 42 or you're born in the 40s and you're in high school, you're in college, and it's a very big blow that hasn't, as you said in the beginning, people still talk about 48 and 67. 61 is not talked about as much, and the reason, one reason for this, I think, is because it's an internal event. It's not an event which you can sort of map on the axis of the Arab-Israeli conflict in terms of like 48, 57, 73, 82. But it was a very big blow for this generation, precisely because it was a first moment of disenchantment with Arab nationalism and the fact that once colonialism is out, we will unite as a nation. So what happened when this union does not last more than 3 years? For a lot of these intellectuals I worked with, this led them into sort of an exploration of questions that had to do with Marxist theory, precisely because they said, well, we need to figure out what these societies are made of. It's not enough to talk about one united Arab nation. And Marxism, through its analysis of class structures, of political economy, of the internal contradictions between, the bourgeoisie, the landowners, and the sort of working classes, gave them a language to figure out internal questions, not only external questions, i.e. not only the contradiction between national liberation and colonialism, but the contradiction between, for example, the sort of like the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah.
In one way or another. And this is a very common story of sort of moving from thinking about the external contradiction to then sort of taking into account the internal contradictions. But what Marxism enabled was not an either-or story, it was an and. So you think imperialism, but you also think exploitation internally as well. And in a way, that seemed to be a much more sophisticated, rigorous, superior idiom to Arab nationalism, so to speak. So at least that's what, someone, the distinguished historiographer and historian, Ahmad Baydun, Lebanese, in my conversations with him, that's what transpired, that basically Marxism was a way for them to try to understand the question of societal dynamics and not only of nation and imperialism. So we move from nation to class in that movement.
And at what point did it stop moving in that direction?
I mean, it's this is a very, very, very interesting question because, so what happens, after people move out of the orbit of Arab nationalist ideologies and parties such as the Ba'ath or the Arab nationalist movement to found Marxist sort of parties and leftist parties that were known as the New Left.
Yeah.
Because they were recent, because the Lebanese Communist Party was founded in 1924, so it's gonna celebrate its 100th anniversary in a year, and we're talking about a story that's happening 40 years after, so nearly half a decade. So it's not that they were the first to basically come up with questions that has
Yeah.
to do with the left. But they were called the New Left precisely because, you know, they came out of the Arab nationalist orbit, and initially they were not gravitating in the orbit of the Soviet Union and of Moscow. So that's the moment. If you're thinking globally, you know, this is the sort of third worldist moment.
Yeah.
This is the moment where people were sort of influenced by the Cultural Revolution in China, the war in Vietnam, and a decade or so after the revolution in Cuba. So you have a constellation of revolutions which come after the sort of 1917 Russian Revolution, which are happening in basically non-Western parts of the world, in China, in Cuba, in Vietnam. And that coincides, of course, with the rise of the Palestinian resistance after the defeat in 1967 of what was called then the defeat of the regimes of Nasser and the Arab armies.
Was there a move away from I'll just call them the 1924 Lebanese Communist Party into the New Left in the 60s? Were there like people who fundamentally said, I don't believe in this now, I now believe in this?
I think the question it's a very important question of boundaries and the question of distinctions. Like, why have another left party when you have first party, you know? And this was a question that some of this generation asked themselves. And in fact, you know, Trabulsi, for example, in his memoirs talks about how some of the comrades in the 60s decided to go and try and work from within the Communist Party, so to speak, that were part of the New Left, but then they came back. So, you know, the questions that people were asking were questions about, first you have theoretical questions. When you're thinking about Marxism, do you only adhere, for example, to the canon of that was sort of posed in the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union's reading of Marx, then Lenin, then Stalin, or are you interested in figures like Antonio Gramsci, which they were Italian Marxists, who was interested in questions of hegemony, that were basically trying to think the questions of culture and the question of basically politics away from a kind of economic sort of determinism. And so this is one question. The question of what are the sort of sources, what are your theoretical sources? Second is the ideological political question. Where do you stand on the sort of geopolitics of the Soviet Union? For example, what happens in Hungary in the 50s, what happens in Czechoslovakia and Prague in the 60s, the incursions of the Soviet Union. So what is your take on Stalin?
So these become like, to use a very sort of 2023 term, these become like wedge issues.
I think so, yes. I think these are very important questions, right? So there's theoretical questions like what do you understand to be the Marxist tradition? But then there are ideological, basically political questions. What is your relationship to basically, you know, the Soviet Union? Some Marxists did not think, you know, so had very, very sort of like critical perspectives on the Soviet Union, how it runs its, you know, the repression, the sort of Stalinist sort of cult of personality, etc. And then you also have questions that have to do with the notion of organization. What kind of party do you want to build? Do you want to build a party that, you know, that has a more loose organizational structure? Do you want a very hierarchical sort of, you know, democratic centralist sort of way of organizing the party? So theory, ideology, and politics and organization, these are all questions that people deal with. I mean, when I was interviewing the members of this generation that founded, you know, in the mid 60s, this organization called Lebanon Ishtiraki, Socialist Lebanon, I mean, they say in retrospect that there was a way in which they thought themselves to be theoretically superior, for example, to the Lebanese Communist Party in terms of its production. I mean, some, of course, in retrospect say that this was a bit blown out of proportion, but this is one way to think about it. But afterwards, in the 70s and the 80s, what happens is that people would, sometimes move out of these parties to join parties that have to do with Palestinian resistance or revolution, and others would move to the Communist Party because, again, based on sort of similar arguments, you would say, what is the need for another Communist Party if you have, for example, a Marxist party that's dealing with questions of class, the Communist Party, or if you have factions in the Palestinian revolutions who are basically fighting, let's say, the anti-imperialist war. So this question is it's a very interesting question. And I think it's one way to look at it. I mean, I tried to schematize it is to sort of see how people sort of move, in different conjunctures and different periods where they think that, well, the difference is huge, but then they say, no, the difference is not that big, and who's the pole that sort of stands in for what do you think are left politics and what is it that you understand by left politics?
Yeah.
So I went a bit too long, but I mean, I think it's a very interesting question.
So in the book, at some point, you say that the main goal of these central figures was emancipation, particularly from colonialism and imperialism, right? And so from their perspective, is this a goal that is more like an endpoint, a binary thing that once you unlock it, khalas, you're unlocked? Or is this a state of being that requires continued attention and one can slouch out of posture at any moment and you never ever fully become emancipated?
I see what you're saying, but what I hear in a way, I hear in your question sort of echoes of sort of our present sort of like concerns.
I'm sure there are echoes,
which is not a bad thing, but I'm trying to think that, well, I think, for this generation, the question of revolution and the question of sort of state power, for example, were sort of related to each other. So taking power.
Yeah, I just wonder,
and which is very different from, I think, what you're trying to think about in terms of a different mode of basically what is it that constitutes emancipation, as I hear in the second part of your question. Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. I mean, I'm like imagining myself listening to a meeting, one of these meetings in the 60s, right? Or reading a pamphlet, and it says, our main goal is emancipation, particularly from colonialism and imperialism, right? And wondering is the idea that we are going to get there. It's just a matter of a few years or a few decades, but we're going to get there at some point. That emancipation is going to happen. If we just do X, Y, and Z, if we just change our mindset, if we just take these bold actions, that is on the table. Or is it something more along the lines of, it's a horizon that we all need to swim towards?
Yeah, it's both, but but the first one was really buttressed by something that has disappeared, I think, in our present, which is the belief in history. That history will redeem you. That basically history is a big march that everyone is basically, marching towards. And one Abbas Baidoun, the great Lebanese poet, said to me that when he was a militant, he thought that he was a foot soldier of history. That you as a militant, you are sacrificing yourself. You are doing the work of history. So history is moving forwards. So, there's this great line that communists said in French, les lendemains qui chantent sous le soleil, or brighter futures, the tomorrow's brighter futures. So in a way, that the idea that if you sacrifice yourself today, you will be redeemed, because history's direction is moving towards that goal, that end point, which is emancipation. And there's evidence for this in the present. I'm telling you the logic that was there, and the evidence in the present is that the revolutions are taking place and they're succeeding. Like Cuba, Vietnam, China. So in a way, you are thinking globally. You are thinking about, basically, you are part of a much, much wider historical movement. And I say this disappeared because I don't think that structure of feeling where we think today that, whatever militants do is going to accumulate towards that history has a direction, and that direction is necessarily basically for better futures. And if you sacrifice yourself today, then you will be redeemed by history. History's court, history's tribunal is going to redeem you as doing basically one step in the right direction. There is this sort of, it's a different world in its sensibilities, I think.
Yeah.
Also, the idea of success, I think was important. That was important then. So that the move was really a global move. There was a line that some thinkers used to say then, that the world revolution in the first world was anti-capitalist. In the second world, which is basically the world of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and its acolytes, was anti-bureaucratic, against the sort of authoritarianism of the states. And in the third world, it was anti-imperialist. Now, of course, there were elements in each of them, but the idea of people trying to connect, militants trying to connect what's happening, what is the relationship between an auto factory strike in Italy, for example, or in France, with the bombing of Vietnam, for example. So people were trying to find connections between the workers' sort of, exploitation and imperial sort of basically ventures and incursions. Is the good high standard of living of people, for example, in northern Western first world countries, dependent on imperial wars all the time, or not? And therefore, how do you do this thing? How do you, because these are not only theoretical questions, these are theoretical questions that have to do with solidarity.
Yeah.
If you're thinking, because they were thinking internationally, if you're an internationalist, then how do you link, Cuba, Beirut, Vietnam, Italy, for example? So it's in that sense, there was a common horizon, I think, and a sort of, I believe in history, and an idea of knowing, where you stand. Like who's your ally in Venezuela? Who are you against in Italy? So that ideological world, I think, is very different now. And it's much more, paradoxically enough, the world we inhabit is much, much more fragmented and much more interconnected. I mean, interconnected via the sort of speed of finance, of media, but also fragmented in terms of sort of, the rise of chauvinistic nationalist sort of powers everywhere. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the US, Lebanese chauvinism in Lebanon with, So it's interesting to sort of think these differences.
Okay. I have a couple big themes I want to discuss. The first one is, if you were to map out on a chart approval ratings, okay, for left political thought in Lebanon over the course of 100 years, over the course of 1923 to 2023, when do you think Marxism, or I don't know what word I should actually use, this sort of left-leaning political ideology, when do you think it was at its peak of broad popularity? And when did it over what period did it see its sharpest decline?
The 60s, of course, are a very, very, worldwide and in Lebanon, a very, very interesting movement. So for sort of like, for left effervescence.
Yeah.
And even the late sort of martyr Samir Asir once wrote that, after 1967, the defeat, there was a very, very, like an intellectual, cultural, political effervescence when it came to basically, the left and the sort of, so there's definitely that moment of the sort of 60s, early 70s before the war, where globally, regionally, and locally, the questions, not only culturally and theoretically, but also in terms of movements of students, movements of tobacco workers in the south, factories like the Gandour factory strike in the 70s. So there were these were moments, in the early 70s where there was the question of thinking through, workers' rights, thinking through imperialism, thinking about sort of student movements, thinking about, the sort of sectorial politics of the left, which was basically workers, peasants, students, let's say 3 big sectors, being quite active. That's one level to think about it in terms of sort of like sectorial politics, but also in terms of articulating certain sort of articulating certain thoughts and certain intellectual production, like let's say committed theater or committed song in the cultural sphere. This was a very, very interesting moment. Now, in the mid 90s, when Hariri, the father, came to power, and the beginnings of the privatization projects started basically being put on track, and the beginnings of the founding of the company that would sort of take over downtown Beirut, Solidaire. The left, the 60s left, played a role which is a very different role from the 60s and the 70s, where it was basically a sort of a political project for revolution. But it became then, it witnessed another effervescence, but it was an oppositional effervescence in the name of safeguarding the memory of the city, in the name of safeguarding the common and the public versus the private and material interests of the few. So the left then, and that was much more of a sort of cultural, intellectual, political left, not less of a mass movement than it was in the 70s. It became more of an oppositional movement to that sort of wave of, that moment of some mid-90s when that, again, globally came in the wake of sort of neoliberal privatizations with Reagan and Thatcher.
And the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Collapse of the Soviet Union, but also the sort of prospects of a peace process between the Arab countries and Israel. So that whole left sort of, the left then articulated not sort of a project for revolution, but rather a project which was sort of premised on oppositions to the new developments that were happening in the world. That locally in Beirut took the form of preserving the memory of the city, preserving the public, and fighting against basically the appropriation of the commons in order to make the city a city which is safe for capital investment only and not for its inhabitants, so to speak.
Yeah. How does this, we were talking about Lebanon almost entirely. I'm curious, as a student of history, how does this trajectory map or sort of project onto other Arabic-speaking countries across the region? So if I take a look at the 100 years in Morocco or Algeria, Tunisia, Sudan, Iraq, Syria, across the board, Yemen, what does it look like? Are they basically the same hits? Did 1961 have the same effect psychologically on a place like Yemen or a place like Sudan?
Honestly, it's a great question, but I'm not sure if I'm sort of like, I didn't study these places as much and depth as I did, in Lebanon. So I cannot, sort of speak with the authority of a social scientist on basically that reverberation. But I think it's definitely a project worth pursuing. But, the main difference, of course, between Lebanon and a lot of Arab countries is that Lebanon was never ruled by sort of military coups.
Yeah.
But the obverse of that, the other side, is that basically is that, okay, we did not have military dictatorships, but what we had is basically a string of civil wars.
And chaos.
So, the first one in 58, and then the second one in sort of 75, and then there's or people say, even started in 73, and whatever that sort of, whatever we're living present since the sort of, assassination of Hayy in 2005 and the string of assassinations. So what I'm trying to say is, it's interesting to sort of see these reverberations. Of course, there were, the Organization for Communist Action in Lebanon had very tight sort of like links with Yemen and the sort of left in Yemen.
Yeah.
When that Yemen was divided. And there were relationships with what was happening in the Gulf, especially through the Arab National Movement and the Zufar Revolution. But I think the interesting case of the interesting case of sort of thinking through the dynamics of, what politics mean in different countries, depending on what sort of regimes of rule are there, make the question, I think, a bit different.
Yeah.
Or the answer is different. Yeah.
Yeah. During the intro, I mentioned that you write for Megaphone. For those who don't know, Megaphone is a very active independent media platform based in Lebanon, focusing almost entirely on politics and social issues. I wonder how does this work that you're doing, this book and this work that you're doing, inform and shape the way you think about our current moment and the current set of problems? Do you feel like we are still in the same century as these people that were thinking and working in the 60s?
I think the answer is yes and no, and it's not a cop-out. I'll try to tell you how it's yes and how it's no. It is yes, in the sense that what was the question of what is the relationship between, how can you articulate a politics in Lebanon which is not premised on infranational communal attachments? They could be sectarian, or they could be regional, or they could be even familial or even ethnic. This is a question that was posed then. It was asked in the question of the dialectic of sect and class.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you move people away from sectarian loyalties to class interest? Because it's not it's not class loyalty, it's class interest, right? So how do you tell people, well, it is in your interest as a member of this class to actually fight for this, that, or the other, as opposed to having the poor and the rich, let's say Christians, be against the poor and the rich Muslims, let's say, in a very, very sort of caricatural way. So that question of what does it mean to actually engage in a politics which does not take its base to be the community, and whether the community is your village, daya, or your sect, taife, or your family, is a question which is, of course, still very important. I mean, you can summarize it in terms of thinking, how can you think the political outside of its imbrication with the social? An abstract form of politics that could take, for example, the nation as its state, as its sport, like you want a liberal Lebanese politics, or it could take a form of sort of class internationalism. That's a question which is still with us. Now, what is different, I think, are many, many things. What is different is, first of all, the country is very different. Demographically, socially, in terms of its social structure, but also in terms of what happened in the past 4 decades in terms of thinking the political outside of the sort of narrow confines of basically the citizen and the worker.
Before you keep on going, in what ways is it different demographically? I think people would be surprised to hear you say that. people who are unfamiliar with Lebanon.
No, in the sense that it is basically, I'm not talking in terms of sectarianism. I'm talking about the scale of the country itself. You know, you're no longer dealing with a country that has, you know, tens of thousands of Palestinian refugees and 2 million, for example, Palestinian Lebanese citizens. You're talking with basically a country which is much larger in terms of, you know, the population of sort of Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees, and the Lebanese, the Lebanese itself, and also in the sense of like the sort of, it's sort of the, you know, the urban sort of development, so to speak, of that country in terms of how does it work. You know, you still have a sort of, you still have a system where you have to go and vote, for example, in the town or village you're from, not where you reside, but in a way, you know, people have moved tremendously, you know. So, but what I was sort of going at is, for example, I think it's very, very important to think how the nature of the Lebanese system is not only related to sort of this question of like sectarianism and community, but how imbricated in that, for example, is a radical form of patriarchal politics. One that is encoded in laws. For example, you know, Lebanese women who marry foreign men cannot give the nationality to their children. How does that impact the reproduction of the system itself? The one that is related to the question of the relationship to the notion of the leader is Zaim, and the inheritance of Zaim. So in a way, what I'm trying to say is that the question of what constitutes power and what constitutes the political has expanded more. But also, you know, in terms of thinking about what is different. What is different, for example, is the kafala system that did not exist in the 60s. So what you have
didn't exist in the 60s?
No. I mean, I don't think, I think according to stuff I've read, again, I'm not an expert on it, but basically it's in the 70s that foreign domestic workers, I mean, you had, of course, you know, you had basically people who were helpers, but the idea of bringing people on a particular contract and, you know, taking their liberty and sort of thinking about that mode of sort of radical exploitation, but also how this is really tied to the sort of structural political economy of Lebanon, i.e. how it enables certain children to emigrate because they can leave their old parents with basically domestic workers with no rights, that then they can basically send money to basically these parents. So there's a whole sort of political economy cycle that has in it imbricated questions of gender, questions of race, questions of basically pseudo-indentured labor, and questions of immigration. That whole cycle that basically enables, you know, this is very different.
Yeah.
This is very different as a social structure, for example.
Interesting.
Right? It's, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, if you think how prevalent it is, I mean, in the crisis, you know, that sort of in here and what happened, you think about the main sort of source of income now is the remittances.
Yeah.
But if you're thinking about remittances, you have to think anthropologically as well, because if you're sending money to someone, and if the young people are the ones who are abroad who are sending people to sort of older people, then who is taking care of the older folks? And how is this politics of care imbricated itself in that very unjust exploitative system where you rob some humans of their freedom, to move, of having, you know, freedom to have breaks from their work, freedom to basically engage in any relationships in order to sustain, so to speak, a particular lifestyle. So what would immigration look like, for example, without the kafala system? What would remittances look like without it? I mean, these are very different questions that are, so there's a whole, that's what I was telling you in terms of the fact that the country is different as well.
Yeah. Okay. If the group of people that you were talking about are the new left, Lebanon's new left, and they were excuse my my language, but they were basically remixing the group of people who came in 1924, right? Who established the party in the 20s. And sort of, it was a sort of variation on a theme. Is there a new left in Lebanon now?
But I disagree with you. I don't think they were remixing whatever happened
so tell me why not.
No, I think I was, as I was trying to say, I think they were very on the question of theory, on the question of ideology, and the question of organizations. They have sort of distinct takes. You know,
sure,
so you're reading. So in a way, you're trying to think the question of power differently. You're trying to think the question of what does it mean to be in a political party differently. I mean, yes, of course, you know, there is a tradition, and that, you know, that Marx is at the center of that tradition. But being part of that tradition does not make you derivative, I think, of the older generations. I mean, they had a sense of the fact that they were different, and they were different in the sources they were using to think.
But insofar as some of them thought, oh, wait, you know what? Maybe I can change this from within.
Yes.
It's not entirely different.
No. I mean, there's a difference, but then there's also the idea of the sort of pragmatic sort of idea of thinking, if there's something which is already there, you try and sort of work with it from within and transform it, or do you build a new thing? I mean, this is a question, a political questions that basically people have all the time, right? Like, do you try and change it from within, or do you try and do something which is a pole which is next to it and maybe opposed to it?
But
and
why was that the thing that they identified as being maybe a candidate for changing, if only because there are some meaningful connections that might,
of course,
warrant the term remix?
No, absolutely. So of course, no, there are meaningful connections, but what I'm trying to argue for is that when in the remix there could be, I mean, I don't know if that's what you intended, but it could be understood as if there was nothing new on the table.
No, of course not. That's not what I mean.
And I'm trying to say that there were, because of basically what was happening in the whole world. I mean, you know, I do subscribe to this notion of a tradition, not in the sense that tradition is something which is against modernity, but tradition is a space where basically people have some central questions that they're attached to, but think it and basically argue over it and disagree over it and produce new things over it. So you can think of religion as a tradition, for example, but you can think also of Marxism as a tradition as well, in the sense that you take different positions, and sometimes, you know, Freud has a sentence about the narcissism of small differences, and sometimes the people that you have the least differences with are the people that basically you want to be the farther apart from.
Of course, yeah, of course.
So there are different dynamics in traditions.
Exactly. So insofar as that was true of these two groups, right? That meaningful differences, but the reason why the differences can be seen as meaningful is because of the proximity, right?
Right.
So going to the question is there a new left in Lebanon?
Yeah. You know, I mean, historically, what was always very interesting for me, sort of like thinking about Lebanon, is that the left always, which is what I was trying to tell you without saying these conditions and 2 questions ago, the left always flourishes when there's a project that is facing it that it can oppose. So the left, for example, in the 60s, that is opposing, for example, and trying to sort of be to the left of the sort of Lebanese ideology and projects that were sort of, you know, grosso modo, sort of penned under the name of Shihabism. General Fadi, who was the president, but then Charles Hello, who came afterwards in 64. So there was a pull that you as a left can say, okay, this is the politics of the regime, I'm against it.
Yeah.
In the 90s, there was another pull, which was Hariri, who came with a big project, which was different, but still it's a project, and the left could basically form itself. The left is always the weakest, I think, at the highest point of inter and intersectarian fighting. Because then what kind of position can you take?
Yeah.
If you have sort of, if like in 89, let's say 90, 1990, you have Michel Aoun and Samir Jaja who are at war against each other. Like as a leftist, you can't be for this project or that project. So there is one of the sort of conditions of possibility of having this sort of oppositional or sort of revolutionary movement was having something to oppose.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting though,
it's like you need you need the right to become the left.
but you need a right with a project, so to speak,
exactly,
in a way, and that you sort of like, that dialectically you basically gain, that has a coherent project of sorts that you gain, your project through posing two things. One is an opposition to it, and two is an alternative to it, because the left has these two wings.
Yeah.
There's the anti and the alternative. But what happened in October 17th is very interesting, I think, in the sort of uprising and the collapse, is that, I mean, we witnessed the collapse of the Lebanese system, but here, unlike the moment of the 60s and the moment of Hariri in the 90s, what we had was, because of the financial and economic collapse, we had a resurgence of the social question, of the question of basically class, of the question of the common, and of the question of the interests of the few. But also we had on the streets a resurgence of new younger generations of feminist movements.
Yeah.
As well, that were and queer movements that were very vocal. So what I'm trying to say is that unlike the 60s and the 90s, there's something that happened here, which is basically a resurgence of questions that have to do with, who has to pay the price for this collapse? Is it most people who lost their very small, sort of like bank deposits of like $10,000, 20, 30, or is it the sort of people who made so much profit on that Ponzi scheme? And when the people were demonstrating on the streets, calling for and against the sort of the policies, legal, administrative policies of this sort of patriarchal system, you had the resurgence of a left of sorts. So it's a very different left, I think, in the sense that it is not necessarily sort of premised on the older style of party with a secretary general and a politburo and, a central committee. But I think amidst that collapse, there were a resurgence of questions that have to do with exploitation, with the social question of class, and also with the question of the sort of patriarchal domination at the heart of this regime, which emerged in the contestations.
Super, super interesting. Before we go to the quick Q&A, what are you working on these days?
A couple of things. One is a book that tries to sort of retrace from the 60s onwards the kind of critical theoretical work that sort of diasporic Arab and Muslim thinkers did in the Western Academy, particularly aimed at sort of the relationship of knowledge to imperialism, mostly through going back and revisiting the work of the distinguished anthropologist Talal Asad and of Palestinian American literary critic Edward Said. There's a bit in the book about that story, but in a way it's a complementary story to the 60s generation in Lebanon that I talked about. It's basically it's complementary in the sense that it's the sort of diasporic.
I wanted to talk to you about this. I'm so glad that you brought this up.
No, go ahead. I mean, I'm trying to really think about what is it that came, how sometimes, these sort of strategies are sort of put under the banner of post-colonial theory, sometimes under sort of critical theory, but for me, it's very important to sort of revisit that moment, to think about how is it that these new immigrants, exilic figures, inhabited, so to speak, the North American and European academy, and how is it that in their dealing with the disciplines they were studying and the works they were doing and the notion of objective knowledges, they started to actually really sort of detect modes of racialization that are embedded in them, which is from where the critique of things like Orientalism that Assad did first in 73 and then Said continued in the sort of groundbreaking Orientalism book that came out in the late 70s. Said really sort of, in the introduction to Orientalism, talks about this question of racism. And talks about sort of Orientalism being some kind of cousin to anti-Semitism. So in a way, I'm interested in really, of course, these agendas have sort of opened up avenues for scholars of different generations to think and rethink how do we understand knowledge? How do we understand its relationship to power? How do we move away from racist stereotypes? But I'm also interested in basically trying to see how can we sort of move beyond these agendas, so to speak. But I mean, so that's what I'm doing actually right now. And a long time ago, more than 20 years ago, I wrote an MA thesis on the work of Ziad Rahbani and the political committed art at AUB between 2000 and 2002. I've never done anything with it, but I'm in the midst of probably thinking about revising it and translating it into Arabic myself to publish it as a small book in Arabic. And it's, paradoxically enough, that thesis is a sort of, in a way, what is at the heart of what this book came about, because it's really trying to think about a very simple question, which is what is the relationship of culture to politics? In the Ziad Rahbani's thesis, it's about the relationship of aesthetics to politics. Like, how do you think theater and music and their relationship to politics? And in that book, it's about the relationship of theory and intellectual production to politics. So I moved from thinking aesthetics to moving. So I'm going back to it actually now to really think that, because, when you said, the first thing you said to me is that pop culture is very important. And I think it's very important, yes, because there's a tendency to think of critical work as work that's academic work or theoretical work or conceptual work only.
Yeah.
But I do think that, the notion of critique itself has to be sort of widened and stretched to sort of encompass pop culture as well. And that's part of my interest in revisiting that early work.
Okay. On that note, I'm going to ask you two final questions. But before I ask the question, is there one domain that you're like, this genre, Mikey, I have some ideas on this genre, so ask me about this genre.
I would answer. Here's my answer. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think it would sort of require whoever is interested to do their research. But I would speak in terms of sort of like genres of literature. I would say reading about the Marxist tradition from Marx to basically Marxism in Lebanon is one way to go about it. Reading about traditions that were dealing with the question of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism.
Yeah.
Thinkers like Césaire's discourse, Aimé Césaire, Discourse on Colonialism, Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, for example. So this is one tradition. The anti-colonial tradition would be a sort of a second one. And then reading about, if they're interested in sort of thinking about this question of the Lebanese civil war and its aftermath, there's a whole tradition of the Lebanese war novel, which people people who have written about it, people like novelists like Huda Barakat, Elias Khouri, Douaihi. So I would, instead of 5 books, I would sort of think in terms of genres and traditions.
Cool.
and sort of like pinpoint people to sort of do work there. And in terms of the pastime question and the question of sort of committed artists, that is kind of funny, is a good place to start. Mahmoud Darwish's memoirs that he wrote very, very early on, Ayam Huzn, I think it's called, I forgot the exact title, are very, very, very interesting to sort of get a sneak peek into his mind as he grew up inside basically Palestine. So there's many sort of like leads I can throw to you. Okay. Sorry, I didn't give you a satisfactory answer, but
no, that's great. The last question I want to ask is asking for a friend, which is, if you were to recommend your favorite pieces of cultural production and pop culture that Ziad Rahbani has been a part of, what would they be?
I'm more partial to the music than the plays.
Okay.
Two basically, I think, three very important albums, which basically sort of catch the sort of three sides of the musician are, one is Hudu Nisbi, a relative calm, which came out after the Israeli invasion, and is basically has many tunes that are in the sort of very much in that sort of world of that he came to basically be very critical of the name, but basically of that sort of fusion of jazz and Arabic music.
Yeah.
The other album which came out around the same time is Ana Mush Kafir, which is more in the sort of Egyptian sort of Arabic lineage that Rahbani is very much influenced by Sayyid Darwish, Sheikh Imam, Zakaria Ahmad. And the third is the sort of masterpiece he did with Fairuz, which was a few years later, which is called Kifak Inta, that he composed for Fairuz. These three albums, I think, represent sort of three different angles at the sort of what I think are very, very complex actually, sort of like compositional mind that can move between sort of between sort of a very much a tradition of Arabic music based on sort of maqam, quarter tones, and also one that sort of thinks that in conversation with bossa nova, Brazilian jazz, and fusion, jazz fusion in general as well. So I think these three albums would be great.
Amazing. Okay, cool. We'll do the quick Q&A as quickly. What are you reading or watching these days?
I'm reading the very, very early works of Edward Said for that second book.
Cool.
Basically, his first book, which was a reworking of his dissertation, which was on Joseph Conrad. And then his second book, which came out a few years later. The first one came out in I think the 66, 7, Joseph Conrad and the Fiction of Autobiography. And the second one is called Beginnings. So it's the pre-Orientalism side. It's kind of the making of what will then sort of be fleshed out in terms of the relationship of knowledge to power.
Cool.
In Orientalism.
What do people most misunderstand about your work?
Oh, I think one misunderstanding that came that was clear to me after a few people read that book that we were talking about is that people thought that I'm an anti-imperialist.
You're anti-imperialist.
Yes.
Okay.
So I was criticized by people who think that they are on the sort of right side of the left for not being anti-imperialist enough. And what in the introduction of that book and the preface, I tried to say that in a way, if one brings back everything that happens politically in the Arab world to measure it via one yardstick, which is the West, then one misses out on a lot of things, because there are some contradictions and some political movements like October 17th in Lebanon, the Arab revolutions generally, which were not really, that were movements for emancipation, but were not directed against, they were not sort of directed against the West.
Yeah.
And in bringing back everything to the question of geopolitics and to the question of basically, where do you stand in terms of national sovereignty versus Western incursions, you can actually end up erasing and the impact of movements such as the Arab revolutions by saying that, it's a plot, it's a conspiracy, or, these were, like people said about the people on the streets in Lebanon on October 17th, that these were basically people who were paid by the embassies, if you remember.
Of course.
Sefarat. Yeah. So this idiom, so I was going against this idiom of takhween, of accusing people of treason, and via using this sort of like anti-imperialist language. And I was misunderstood to basically be against anti-imperialism, while I'm not at all. But I'm just saying that it can't be the exclusive game down.
Yeah, if everything is put in black and white, you lose most of the photo. Well, it's has been really, really nice talking to you, Fadi. If anyone's interested in connecting, it's very easy to find your information online, and the book is sold everywhere and is also available online. So Fadi, thanks so much.
Thank you, Maki. Thanks so much for hosting.